Hi, Dr. Tomerdal. Welcome to today's conversation on emotion and cognition. For my presentation, as you know, my name is Yuri Lopez, and this is for Education 5361. So the project, or rather the presentation, is based off of two main pieces of research. The first of which is this one, that is titled, "We Feel, Therefore We Learn, the Relevance of Affective and Social Neuroscience to Education." And so within this research, written by Imordo, Yang, and Damasio, it essentially described the notion of emotional thought, or rather like the theory around this term that was created, labeled emotional thought, which is the neurobiological evidence that suggests that the aspects of cognition that we recruit most heavily in schools, namely learning, attention, memory, decision-making, and social functioning, are both profoundly affected by and subsumed within the processes of emotion. So this idea that the way in which we think our rational thought, our ideas that are developed from attention, memory, decision-making, and social functioning, all of these things are very heavily intertwined with our emotional processing. And so they put it together as this term, emotional thought. And so within the paper, they provide a hypothesis that emotion-related processes are required for skills and knowledge to be transferred from the structured school environment to real-world decision-making, because they provide an emotional rudder, is a term, to guide judgment and action. And so within the introduction, they make these key points that these high-level cognitive skills that are taught in schools, so specifically reasoning, decision-making, and processes related to language, reading, and mathematics, do not function as rational, like disembodied systems. So essentially, as much of our lessons and curriculums are developed, it's not this linear process that it occurs, but rather this like intertwined and almost like symbiotic processes and systems that are supportive of one another. And so they have this particular quote that I thought was really just like thought-provoking. It says, "It is not that emotions rule our cognition, nor that rational thought does not exist. It is rather that the original purpose for which our brains evolved was to manage our physiology, to optimize our survival, and to allow us to flourish." And so I thought this really kind of pulled me out of this idea that we think and we feel only for the purpose of learning in these four-walled classrooms with textbooks and desks. And I think that oftentimes in the educational landscape, we forget that the reason why we operate the way in which we do, or our brains have evolved to work in the way that they have. The purpose of it was not for us to, get through Algebra 2. The purpose of that, or rather the evolution of our brain processes, is to optimize our survival, right? It's to be able to make decisions in the real world. And then we think it way back into like cave days, or like prehistoric times. We're looking at literal survival, where there is an animal that is approaching me. How am I going to get out of this situation? Or how am I going to best be able to maybe kill the animal so therefore I can eat? Like, there were several different reasons why spatial distancing or problem solving were developed outside of a textbook in the classroom. And so I think that kind of perspective really brought this entire article kind of to the forefront of understanding. And so this brings this idea that there's a link between the body and the mind, and that the brain and the body can influence each other. And in brief, the learning, or within learning, in this complex sense in which it happens in schools or the real world, is not a rational or, again, disembodied process. And so a lot of the research, as we know within neuroscience and like research within neuroscience, a lot of it is heavily based off of when we study people who have had a damage to a part of the brain. And therefore, we start to learn what that part of the brain actually has as an output in behavior pattern. And so they studied people who had damaged parts of their brain. And after sustaining damage to the specifically ventromedial prefrontal cortex, these patients' social behavior was compromised. And they like making them oblivious to the consequences of their actions and sensitive to the other's emotions and unable to learn from their mistakes. I think, and that's specifically, I think, speaks to how it can actually impact, or how what this tells us into about learning spaces, so like classrooms. These patients' ability to make advantageous decisions became compromised in ways that they hadn't been before. So they would not perform adequately at their jobs in spite of having the required skills. They would make poor business deals in spite of knowing the risks involved. They would lose their savings and choose the wrong partners in all sorts of relationships. So further testing really brought out these findings where they didn't have a problem with that primary knowledge or knowledge access or logical reasoning as they like before assumed. It's not that they didn't have the knowledge or the information, it's that they couldn't apply it. And so there was no loss of knowledge, there was no lowering of any IQ, but instead it became clear that the disturbances in the realm of emotion that before were seen as like a secondary disturbance or like a secondary like brain damage, it actually better accounted for that poor decision making. So by compromising the possibility of evoking emotions associated with certain past situations, decision options and outcomes, the patient became unable to select the most appropriate response based on that past experience. So their logic and knowledge, again, could be intact, but they failed to use past emotional knowledge to guide the reasoning process. And so missing a brain region that is now understood as needed to trigger a cascade of neurological and somatic events that together then would create social emotions such as embarrassment, compassion, envy, admiration. So their social behavior suffered. Without the ability to really access any of those intuitions that are our intuitions based off of our emotions, right? That accrue through this emotional learning and social feedback, decision-making, and rational thought, all of that became compromised, as did their learning from their mistakes and their successes. So like no matter how much knowledge you acquire, like how much long-term or like memory you accrue based off of what you quote unquote learn, once that you apply that learning and then you are not able to process mistakes or successes, since it is no longer tied to any kind of emotion for you to learn from, then it's in the application process that the damage is actually fully seen. And so when I really kind of thought about this, and one of the metaphor that was used is that emotions are not just messy toddlers at a china shop running around and breaking obscure, delicate cognitive glassware. Instead, these emotions, they're more like the shelves underlying the glassware. Without them, cognition has less support. So as we see, and like I put a picture here, without the shelves, the glassware would just completely cascade. And it might still exist as glass, it will exist as glass, right? Knowledge will exist and continue to be there, but there is no way to use it anymore and apply it, and then therefore lead a fruitful, thriving life based off of your applications of that knowledge. And so I put Yuri's thoughts here in this particular section based off of this quote. As the prefrontal patients show, the processes of recognizing and responding to complex situations, which we suggest hold the origins of creativity, are fundamentally emotional and social. As such, they are shaped by and evaluated within a cultural context and, as we described in the previous section, are based upon emotional processing. Now, what this really made me think about is the way in which our current educational systems and curriculums and lessons and the way in which we actually train teachers is based off of this like antiquated model of pour in information and then student will absorb. And once student absorbs, then they are quote unquote successful. Like they should be prepared to apply it. But the reality is that pouring in is one part. Being able to apply it both involves the emotional landscape, and it's a symbiotic system that we do not often care for. And as we saw, or as I saw in several of the classrooms that I observed, and I was supporting my teachers specifically through teaching during COVID and teaching online, is that there was a completely different engagement process that occurred as students were less able to have emotional support. They were less able to have a human connection. They were less able to have access to collaboration. And furthermore, they were disengaged from this sense of an entity like a school or my teachers caring about me. And that had a very, very large impact on their performance within those classes. And so, as we look at emotions, or rather the physiological and evolutionary account for emotions and cognition, automatic responses to morality, creativity, hierarchy, and culture. So emotions comprise cognitive as well as sensory processes. The aspects of cognition that are recruited most heavily in education, that are including learning, attention, memory, decision-making, motivation, and social functioning, are both profoundly affected by emotion and in fact subsumed within the process of emotion as stated before. So emotion is then the basic form of decision making, and processes of recognizing and responding, the very processes that form the interface between cognition and emotion. It's where we see origins of creativity, like this artistic, scientific, technological innovations that are unique to our species are derived from emotion. And so further, out of these same kinds of processes, there is this like special kind of like human innovation. So social creativity is what we call morality and ethical thought. And so emotions entail the perception of an emotionally competent trigger, a situation either real or imagined that has the power to induce an emotion, as well as a chain of physiological events that enable changes in both the mind and the body. So this is Damasio, 1994. These changes of the mind that involve the focusing of attention, calling up relevant memories and the learning of these associations between events and their outcomes, among other things, are the process with which education is really the most concerned. And so they created a framework, or rather a model, the ways in which emotion and cognition, as they overlap each other, then create emotional thought. That way you can see really that thoughts can trigger emotions, which then play out in the mind and on the body. And then the body has sensations based off of those thoughts, actual or simulated, that contribute to feelings, which can in turn influence thought. So it's kind of like this overlapping, revolving, again, symbiotic relationship between emotion and cognition. And so the educational implications have a sense of like a call at the very end of this piece of research, in which children, which the focus is often on the logical reasoning skills and the factual knowledge that are most direct indicators of educational success. But the reality is that presents two main problems. Is that we create curriculums that are based off of this notion that recall or learning is divorced somehow from emotion. And then second, in that in teaching students to minimize the emotional aspects of their academic curriculum, educators may be encouraging students to develop a sort of knowledge that inherently does not transfer to real world situations, which is essentially what we see in most classrooms. So in conclusion, these new neurobiological evidence regarding the fundamental role of emotion and cognition, it holds the potential to improve, or rather for important innovations in the science of learning and the practice of teaching. And so it leads us to chapter 11 of Emotional Development, written by Alice Jones, where she actually goes into the description of emotion in education, and then specifically what occurs or what is most significant in preschool years, middle school years, secondary school, and adolescence, and then lifelong learning. So we see emotion and education where brain imaging does show the connection between cognition and emotion at the neural level, which we just discussed. And although the amygdala is a part of the limbic system, which is a primitive part of the brain that long it was perceived to be central to emotional processing, it also plays a part in the role of directing attention, which is actually considered a cognitive task. So we already have a lot of science and things that are rooted outside of, or rather things that are rooted in, let's say, one system or believed to be in one system, but actually it is this, again, symbiotic intertwining of processes and systems. So the anatomical evidence for the prefrontal cortex, meaning areas typically associated with working memory, attention, and sensitivity to reward, and the subcortical limbic structures typically associated with emotional processing, including the amygdala, suggest a functional link between the prefrontal executive processes and the emotional motivational processes of the limbic system. So how does this all kind of play out in the different phases of development for like our little humans and our people? Preschoolers must learn to adapt to this new system, right? Or rather to new school systems that has the expectation to meet new goals in literacy, numeracy, and socialization. So the demands of this new academic environment will bring emotions such as excitement, anxiety, and fear. And the need for emotional regulation becomes apparent, which will have a significant influence in their ability to adapt and learn. And so they, within the chapter, they go into these two main aspects of this development, which is temperament. And rather, temperament is known as the quote unquote constitutional differences in reactivity and self-regulation. Meaning the term constitutional, that if it's as if you're like born with it, like whatever you are born with. Emotion within the context of cortical arousal then tells us that when we have this constitutional difference in reactivity and self-regulation, or rather a believed one, where you are like cortically aroused by, you have to have higher low levels of cortical arousal. And so if you have a high level of cortical arousal, it means that it takes a lot of stimuli for you to have an emotional like dysregulation. So you have the ability to regulate for longer periods of time. You, for example, it is a child that doesn't get annoyed very easily or doesn't have their quote unquote feelings hurt very easily. They have a high level of cortical arousal. Or rather, if you have a low level of cortical arousal, then it doesn't take very much to get you to, I don't know, cry or have an outburst of some sort. And then the need for this development of emotional regulation is the ability to regulate our own emotions. So during early infancy, we'll start to see that there's a rapid growth in the areas related to emotional regulation through cognitive reappraisal, verbalizing feelings, disengaging attention from negative stimuli. Then in the middle school years, we have emotional processing for students with social, emotional, and/or behavioral difficulties in the classroom. Behavioral problems start to arise. And so when we have students with several or maybe more intense behavioral problems, we see that the outcomes of children that have had, those are outcomes of children that have experienced harsh discipline and physical abuse in their early years. And so they process emotions differently. There's an increased attention to the quote unquote angry face stimuli from research studies. And there's a delayed disengagement from the angry face when not relevant to questions. So there's attention constantly being paid to the angry face out of fear. There's also, there was a section on conduct disorder, or CD, where they really looked at students that had a conduct disorder. So essentially that students that did not have a regular response to someone else's violated rights, or rather they were violating other people's rights, whether that was physically, emotionally. And so it was found that there was reduced gray matter in the right temporal lobes. There was poor processing within the visual and auditory displays of emotions commonly associated with distress, like fear and sadness. There were difficulties in aversive learning paradigms. And there was damage to amygdala and lessened amygdala response to distress stimuli. Then there was also a reduced amygdala reactivity to the fearful face stimuli, which then created this conduct disorder where they were not able to visually process these like sadness or fear in others. During secondary school and adolescence, there's a fixed and acquirable, there's this notion of fixed and acquirable views of intelligence. So essentially, or rather how it was described, there were like entity theorists versus incremental theorists. And by theorists, it meant that like children in the ways in which they perceived intelligence. Either it was something that was just like, I was born with this kind of intelligence, or it was, I can grow my intelligence. And so that was largely impacted by self-esteem. And the adolescent brain is characterized by maturation of the limbic system with heightened reward sensitivity in conjunction with the protracted development of the prefrontal cortex and developing cognitive control. It's this disparity between the development of these two systems, which may be really the underpinning of the risk factors often observed in adolescents. And so that leads us then into lifelong learning, which is specifically like young adults, meaning in the particular studies within the chapter, they were undergraduates. As we know, like brain changes continue past the teenage years and through really, I believe it's the age of 25. Morphological differences have also been linked to changes in behavior over the period of adulthood. Increases in voxel intensity in the insula correct, cingulate and caudate nucleus during fMRI scans are linked with functional changes in self-awareness and awareness of one's own emotional behavior. And so the insula has been associated with processing information from the body about physical sensations and emotional feelings, known as interoception, which is suggested to be central to self-awareness. And there was this focus on stressors as a lifelong obstacle, meaning that your need to continuously emotionally regulate, your need to continuously be able to actually balance your emotions based off of like the things that happen in life and the lives and ups and downs are a significant demonstration, or rather kind of continuous test of how well you can regulate your emotions. And so my final thoughts, and these are kind of like my little tech talk, is that, well, emotion and cognition as symbiotic and intertwined. It is so tightly intertwined that they cannot be divorced, nor are they linear. And our traditional educational systems operate as if learning and emotional support are linear, when in fact they are not. And so as we continue to see how it is that we can actually develop spaces and learning spaces that are more conducive to the way in which our brain actually learns, it makes me think about adapting lessons and teacher training for teachers to learn to develop children through the lenses of the intertwining of neural systems and the output of behavior, all of which I think will expand the notion of achievement and access for all children. And thank you. That's it.